A central theme running through all of Machiavelli's writings is fortune and the vicissitudes of fortune. Fortune, he says, is what rules the world around us. But he always imagines her as a woman. She is very unpredictable and very capricious. You never know when she's going to rise you up to the highest heights and when she's going to knock you down on your knees.
Why is an Italian man from the 15th century worth writing about?
I think there are at least two good reasons for that. On the one hand, Machiavelli has exerted an influence over the development of Western political thought, like very few others. There are not many discussions about realpolitik, the nature of rulership, the role of virtue or the lack thereof in public life, which do not at some point come back to Machiavelli in his writings. The second reason is closely connected with that. When we think of Machiavelli, it's quite natural for us to think of the adjective Machiavellian. That is to say, someone who is shrewd, cunning, a little bit amoral, willing to do things that they probably shouldn't do in other areas of life. And that association, which I'm sure we'll discuss in further detail later on in the show, has often coloured the way we perceive the man. His life, however, is quite different, or gives us a quite different idea of, or gives us a quite different impression. Although he often did things which were questionable, he was far from being this infallible political genius that we may think of. In actual fact, he was a very human person, a flawed personality, who was often getting things wrong, who was often finding himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing the wrong thing with the wrong people, and getting found out. So I think, on the one hand, we should look at Machiavelli from the point of view of his enduring relevance. So I'm not very keen on the idea of relevance as a criterion of historical study, for his relevance to political discourse, and on the other hand, because of the extent to which his life does sort of jars with that a little bit.
It seems like some of the established thought was that he was kind of born with this immutable characteristics, these amazing political thinker, and yet upon reading about his life, it seems like he kind of blunders and slowly gets less worse and less worse and less worse, and then eventually ends up at some degree of capability.
Less worse. He is always making blunders. From the beginning of his political career to the last moment, he is always getting things wrong. That's not to say he doesn't get a lot of things right, but he is always making miscalculations. He's better, I think, on paper than he is in his own political career. But it is certainly true that because of Machiavelli's enduring resonance within the field of political thought, or the history of political thought, many people, even today, have been inclined to believe that he was born, like Athena from the head of the philosophy gods, with this great insight. And it is, I'm not saying it's completely wrong, because one can detect the genesis of his ideas in his thinking from a comparatively early date. But it is, I think, mistaken to believe that he was a man without flaws, without personal failings, without problems and difficulties. But for me, as I hope I've shown in the book, that makes him all the more relatable, all the more engaging and personable. I often say that, there are very few political thinkers in the world that I'd like to go for a pint with, but Machiavelli is certainly one of them.
Is that why he's still notorious today, then? Why is it? There's lots of Renaissance figures that could have been still used in common parlance. I mean, Machiavellianism, his surname has become an entire topic within its own right. Why is he so notorious?
Sure. Well, Machiavelli's significance as a political thinker and his unfortunate reputation stems from the fact that he broke quite significantly, in many respects, with earlier traditions of political thought, particularly with earlier ideas of rulership. Prior to Machiavelli's birth, it was quite common to believe that princes who wish to rule properly and to remain in power should do so by acting virtuously. And virtue was understood in a mixture of kind of Stoic and Christian terms. That is to say, it was believed that a ruler should evince those virtues which we should all manifest in our lives. We should be honest, they should be decent, they should be prudent, they should be wise, continent, etc., etc. They should act always with justice. Machiavelli, for very pragmatic reasons, thinks that while this might be a very good approach to adopt as a private citizen, he thinks that experience has showed that in practice it's not such a good idea. In fact, in times of turbulence, such as those in which he was living, it can actually be a disadvantage to act honestly or with generosity or with mercy or compassion, etc. So in The Prince, his most famous work, I should say notorious work, he suggests that it is a prince who wishes to stay in power should, as well as having an independent military force of citizens, he should be parsimonious rather than generous. He should be cruel rather than compassionate. Machiavelli does say that if he can make himself loved with the people, that's a lovely thing, but love is a less reliable sentiment as a basis for political power than fear. Better to be ready to be dishonest than honest, etc., etc. So Machiavelli is breaking with this early tradition in saying that a prince needs to act in a way that is not always in conformity with traditional ideas of virtue or of ethical goodness. He wasn't, I should stress, the absolute first to make these points. When, at the very early on in his career, in 1499, Florence sacks and arrests one of its leading military commanders, a guy called Paolo Vitelli. And Paolo Vitelli is responsible for leading a campaign to recapture Pisa, which has rebelled against Florence a little bit before. For whatever reason, Vitelli throws away a golden opportunity to capture Pisa. And the Florentines attribute this either to incompetence or to treachery. And so they arrest him and they bring him for trial to Florence. And there's a big debate about whether he should just be executed straight off, even though there are doubts about his guilt, or whether you should give him the benefit of the doubt. And there are very good or powerful arguments made in the councils that while an private individual should act with compassion and understanding and justice, things are different for a state. A state should act in such a way that it preserves its own interests. And so they decide to execute Vitelli, encourager les autres. And we can see in this idea of reason of state later becomes known, that the state should follow a different set of moral precepts to private individuals, an early foretaste of ideas that Machiavelli is going to develop more fully. And in The Prince, he really works out all the implications of this. Unfortunately, he's writing against, as I said earlier, a very, very, very specific set of political circumstances. When he's writing, he's lost his job. Florence has changed hands from being a republic. It's now gone back into the hands of the Medici. It's beset by factional divides, and the whole of Italy is in the grip of a very complex series of wars. It's evident that Machiavelli needs a job, and that to get a job, he needs to persuade the Medici that he's a good advisor. And to do that, he needs to show them how to stay in power within these circumstances. And that's why he suggests being, cruel, dishonest, etc., when necessary, I should stress. But the work is written in a deliberately discreet and subtle way. Machiavelli knew very well that he couldn't simply say to the Medici, hi, I'd like a job, here's what I think about your situation. So he dresses it up in a very abstract way, as if he's writing a very disinterested piece of political philosophy. And that has made it very easy for people from soon after it was written to read it out of its context, if I can put it that way, to see it as a repository of universal ideas rather than an attempt to address very precise concerns. And the problem, I mean, that's a legitimate way of reading anything. I'm not going to cast aspersions on my colleagues in political science, no matter what I might feel. But as soon as you take that step of reading it out of its context, then there's a tendency, or a temptation, I should say, to project your historical reading of the Prince back onto Machiavelli. And that does lead us to misrepresent his ideas, his background, his intentions.
What was his personality like? It seems like someone who would write this sort of stuff would be very game playing, high on the dark triad score, narcissistic, no empathy. What sort of a man can write this sort of a work?
Well, the short answer is a clever one, but a pleasant one. If I were to describe Machiavelli in a word, I would say that he was a bit of a lad.
That's so good. That three-letter word that every university student rugby player desires to be called. That's Niccolo Machiavelli.
Well, I say it a little bit in jest, of course, but it is meant seriously, because I mean, let's go back to the circumstances in which it was written. The Prince was written, because it's a good insight into the type of guy he was. A little bit before, he loses his job. He loses his job as a senior bureaucrat within the Florentine government, because he has aligned himself with a series of Republican system of government, and afterwards foolishly allowed himself to get caught up in, or implicated in, a conspiracy against Florence's new rulers, the Medici. So he gets arrested, after that, and thrown into prison and tortured. That shows straight off that he's in the wrong place at the right time, at the wrong time. Other bureaucrats who worked in the same office as him, such as his boss, Marco di Virgilio Adriani, did not lose their jobs, let alone get thrown into jail. So he's doing the wrong thing. While he's in jail, he writes a series of poems, 2 poems, to his old friend Giuliano de' Medici, who he knew as a kid. And these are very, very, very funny verses. For somebody who's been tortured, lying in a stinking prison cell, they're very amusing. They poke fun at himself. He pokes fun at himself. He contrasts himself. He adopts the form of heroic poetry at certain moments to mock himself, because he's not being heroic. He's being cowardly. Eventually he gets let out, and because he doesn't have much cash and he's very miserable, he goes to stay on his farm in the countryside. In the countryside, he writes a letter to a friend of his a little bit later, in which he describes a typical day. What does he do in the countryside? Well, he gets up in the morning, he goes and catches birds in the countryside, by the side of a river and in the fields. He reads some poetry, all very nice. Then comes lunch, he goes home, has a bite to eat, and in the afternoon he goes to the pub in the local village. There he gambles and drinks with all the good-for-nothings, his words, and they get drunk and they have fights or whatever. He's not coy about this. He's quite open. What he doesn't mention in that letter is that a little bit later he has several children at this point. He's married. He also has an affair with a localish girl, one of many affairs he had. And then later in the evening, when everything's kind of settled down, he goes into his study and he puts on the clothes of the court, and he starts to read and write. So in that moment, we can see all the rich, very human contradictions and failings of this man. He is very, very clever. But he also, he likes a drink, he has affairs, he's a bit of a lad. What can I say?
He has affairs with both men and women, right? He's got tons of kids, he's got a wife that loves him, and it seems like he loves too, but he's also spraying it around, for want of a better word.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. He certainly has a lot of affairs with other women. he some of them are very, very intense affairs. So towards the end of his life, he has a long, long affair with a woman 20 odd years his junior, called Barbara Salutati. And he writes, again, a lot of poems to her that are very self-mocking, very acutely aware of his own failings. Indeed, in one poem, he even seems to allude to the fact that he may have been suffering some erectile dysfunction at the time. We think he also had some relations with guys too. There is a little bit of uncertainty here, but I think there's probably enough evidence that we can be pretty sure about it. Was this unusual? At the time, well, officially, homosexuality and all homosexual relations are illegal, although there is a certain ambiguity in the legislation. But nonetheless, it is quite common, under the radar, effectively. So he's certainly not strange, not out of the ordinary in that regard.
What are some of the other big catastrophes that he goes through? I want to get onto his philosophy and his successes in a bit, but it seems like he has a nice litany of things that go wrong. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he seems to have a knack for being able to do that.
Sure. Well, one of the important parts of Machiavelli's job as a bureaucrat, as the second chancellor of the Florentine Republic, was going on embassies. He was usually, I think on one occasion towards the end of his life, he was actually an ambassador, but on all the other occasions, he was simply an emissary. So, in other words, he couldn't agree things on his own, on the strength of his own name. He had to keep working on the instructions of people back home. And to start with, he's pretty bad at this, actually. We can't blame him too much because, he's his early missions, he's still in his late 20s, very early 30s. And he's never done that kind of thing before, but still he is pretty naive. One of his first missions is to a woman called Caterina Sforza, known as the Tigress of Forli, and she is a formidable woman. She's been defending the independence of her little tiny state in the midst of near constant threats from all sides. Anyway, Machiavelli goes along. He has to secure a deal whereby she'll let her son, who's a mercenary, fight for Florence on similar terms, and he has to try to avoid giving away too much on Florence's behalf. And Caterina, who's a wily old woman, she's not old, a wily woman, very well educated, keeps sort of dropping hints. She has to drop hints because there are other people present at these meetings who can't be allowed to hear everything. So she keeps dropping hints, and Machiavelli just doesn't notice, just doesn't pick up on them. So she keeps having to send her secretaries to, have a word with him and say, what we're really trying to say is this, pay attention. Anyway, he gets a bit better in time, but he's in later missions, he still kind of misjudges the tone. So later he goes on several missions to the King of France. And the basic point of these missions is to get the King of France, who is often mounting expeditions to Italy in pursuit of his claims to the Kingdom of Naples and to the Duchy of Milan, to defend Florence against its enemies. Anyway, on one of these missions, he has to gain the favour of the King's chief minister, Georges d'Amboise. And he catches Georges at one point outside, and he says, let me explain Italian politics to you. What the king really has to understand is this. This is a guy in his mid-30s who has, he's not a fool, but he's lecturing one of Europe's foremost political figures. And Georges d'Amboise listens, and he says, yeah, thanks. I don't need any lessons from you, chum. Jumps on his horse and rides off. Anyway, and he goes on like this. Perhaps the most famous mission is where he meets Cesare Borgia for the first time. This is in mid-1502. Cesare Borgia, the son of Alexander VI, the Pope at the time, is trying to carve out a state for himself in central Italy. He's just captured a city called Urbino, beautiful, beautiful city on a high kind of plateau that towers above the surrounding countryside. Machiavelli and his companion, who is a bishop, arrive late at night. They don't arrive when they're supposed to. They have to creep in through a back gate in the middle of a rainstorm, and they're caught by guards, and they're dragged before Cesare, soaking wet, covered in mud, in the middle of the night, having not even managed to get into the city correctly. And Machiavelli is just in awe of Cesare at that moment. And that does colour, he gets over it quite quickly, but that does kind of colour his relations with Cesare. More broadly speaking, his political errors are more fundamental, and I've already alluded to some of them. So for much of his political career, as a officially objective, apolitical bureaucrat, he just kind of does his job, but in time he aligns himself more and more and more with the defense of a republican system of governance. And he becomes quite vehement in around 1509, 1510, 1511. And there's good reason for that. It's because the Republic is under threat from foreign attack. But it's also exactly the wrong time to be doing that, the wrong time to be aligning himself with the Republic, because everything falls apart and the Medici come back and the Republic falls. And as I've said, he gets sacked and arrested. He spends a lot of time trying to get a job with the Medici because he's not a rich man. He needs to work. Unfortunately, he doesn't do very well. The Prince is written, as I said earlier, as a job application. But when he comes to present the Prince to the person to whom it's dedicated, Lorenzo de' Medici, he comes at the wrong time. Lorenzo has just received a gift of 2 hunting dogs from somebody else, and he doesn't even look at the book. So Machiavelli is really angry, and he goes off saying, "Damn these Medici, blah, 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 blah." Anyway, years later, he eventually earns their trust and is sent on a few relatively minor missions, but is involved in their plans their campaign to defend Florence from their enemies. And he just wormed his way back into their circle when, lo and behold, they're kicked out of Florence as well. So he's again on the wrong side. By then, however, it's too late, and he dies sadly, rather disappointed.
So what's the highest office that he gets to? It seems like he's constantly selling lows and buying highs and doing an awful lot of work to try and climb back up. Also, sure. If you are listening somewhere beyond the grave, Niccolo, it sounds like such a turbulent environment that it would have been very difficult to have weathered those storms. That period would have been almost impossible without the foresight of clairvoyance.
It wasn't impossible. There were people who did manage to weather the constitutional shifts in Florence without suffering too much hardship. His boss, for example, Marcello Livardelli Adriani, who is just senior to him, stays in office as Florence's top bureaucrat through several changes of government, or changes of regime at least. But you're right in saying that these were very, very, very turbulent times. It was extremely hard to stay on your feet. It was hard enough for people of some wealth and independent political standing, but it was even harder for somebody like Machiavelli, who came from a fairly modest background. He wasn't poor, but nor was he rich by any stretch of the imagination. Who began life under a bit of a shadow because of his father's indebtedness and possible illegitimacy, etc. He really had to work to get anything, really, and that was difficult. There were various routes to achieve security and stability for an intelligent guy at the time. It was not unusual for those who had some education and literary ability to seek the patronage of more powerful rulers or more powerful figures. Alternatively, you could seek office as a secretary or a chancellor, as Machiavelli did. But in that case, it was difficult to weather the storms, and it was difficult to know when to involve yourself in the political fray and when not to.
What are the most common misconceptions about his philosophical stances?
Well, the most common one we've already touched upon, and that is to say that Machiavelli was a kind of prophet of, if not evil, certainly amorality. This is a reading of The Prince that has been common from very shortly after it appeared in print. It was never published in his lifetime, but it was published very shortly afterwards. He was, attacked from both sides of the confessional divide during the Reformation, attacked by Catholics because they saw this as an enemy of the virtuous rulership they were trying to defend in the pre-Tridentine period. It was attacked by Protestants who saw this as an emblem of all the kind of awful things that Catholics were doing. In France, many of your listeners may perhaps be familiar with the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, where on one particular night on the feast of St. Bartholomew, the Protestants of Paris were butchered. And those who survived often describe the King of France's actions as very Machiavellian. So that gives you a sense of the extent to which, within a few decades of his death, he's already become a kind of shorthand for wickedness and evil.
So was he wasn't called immoral during his own lifetime because the work wasn't sufficiently widely passed around for people to work out what he was up to?
Well, it was. It did generate a bit of a stir after he began circulating it, but nothing compared to what happened in later decades.
What do you think? What do you think he would have thought of that? What do you think he would have thought of where his work was taken after his death?
Well, this is an interesting question because it comes back to the issue of for whom Machiavelli was writing, or who he thought he was writing for. Those who have been inclined to see him as a kind of prophet of amorality have supposed that he was writing for posterity. Leo Strauss and Harvey Mansfield have been particularly keen to advocate this line of thought. Now, it wasn't uncommon for people at the time to write for posterity. One of Machiavelli's favourite authors was a guy called Francesco Petrarca, who we know in English as Petrarch, and he was, an incredibly important poet, second only to Dante in importance, in fact. And he wrote, during his lifetime in the 14th century, a letter to posterity. He was constantly re-editing his letters to ensure that they were read in exactly the way he wanted them to be read after his death. He spoke frequently about how it was possible to sort of have an existence beyond the grave, and he was always comparing himself to people who had an enduring legacy. But I don't think Machiavelli was like that. I don't think he was writing for posterity at all. He occasionally alludes to people in the future, but it's always very clear that he's writing for a specific moment against a very specific background, a very specific constellation of circumstances. So I think each of his major works was intended to address an immediate objective. The Prince, was designed to respond to the challenges facing the Medici after they returned to power in Florence in 1512. The Discorsi, his other major work, was dedicated to some of the friends he made in the Orti Ocellaria, a set of gardens where he met young men who were either a mixture of people who were on the periphery of the Medici circle or those who were opposed to the Medici. And there is a suggestion that it's intended to cultivate a new set of political sensibilities in their hearts. I think he probably would have been surprised at the fact that he has had such an enduring appeal, that he had a readership lasting 5 centuries after his death. Do I think he would be surprised by that his work was read as or misread as praise of amorality or even immorality? I'm not sure about that, because he was very conscious of the extent to which he was breaking with tradition in The Prince. He was, very, very well aware of it. He signals it himself. So the answer is, I think he would have been both surprised and unsurprised. Sorry, that was a typical historian's answer.
Very diplomatic, yeah, indeed. Back to the misconceptions.
In what sense? I'm sorry.
The most common misconceptions of his philosophy.
As I said, the most common misconception arises from the Prince, that he is attempting to suggest that rulers who wish to remain in power should be absolutely immoral in all circumstances. As I said, if you read it out of its context, then you can make that argument. But I'm not convinced it's completely true, because in fairness, if you actually read The Prince in detail, he is very, very careful to qualify these, kind of scare quotes that are often pulled out. He says, yeah, I mean, it's nice for a prince to be loved. I mean, that's what we should aim for. But if you can't, then the next best thing is to be feared. So, weigh a doubt against a certainty. However, he also says that if you're going to make yourself feared, be careful not to push that too far. Because if you make yourself into a monster, then you're going to arouse a whole bunch of animosity amongst your subjects, and they're going to at some point decide that it's better to take the risk of ousting you, even though that is extremely uncertain, he says elsewhere, than to remain under your yoke. He doesn't, of course, again, say that it is necessary always to reject the precepts of amorality. He merely says, reject the precepts of conventional morality. He merely says that a prince should know how to act contrary to the dictates of conventional morality when necessary, and how to be virtuous in a new sense, virtuous in the sense of being a man, being manly in his words. So, yeah, the common misconceptions, that's the most common misconception. I think we can, it's perhaps worth noting that even those who do present Machiavelli as an advocate of amorality, or a prophet of evil, if you like, have difficulties in reconciling The Prince with some of his other works, which offer a somewhat different view of political action, like the Discorsi, for example. The Discorsi is nominally an explanation of how one should read the first 10 books of Livia's history of Rome, but in actual fact is an analysis of how states of all kinds, not just principalities, become great and stay great. And that ends up, the answer to that is that they have to stay free, in his words, because you can't be great unless you're free. So the question is, how do you become free and keep your liberty? And the answer is, once again, virtue. Obviously, virtue not in the traditional sense, but virtue in the sense of being willing to do anything for the defense of the Republic, being a true vir, willing to sacrifice even yourself in defense of the Republic. Willingness to, as Machiavelli says, kill, rape, steal, whatever necessary to protect the Republic. And then he talks about the way in which you can cultivate that virtue, because people tend to be self-interested. The more prosperous people become, he says, the more likely they are to think only of themselves. So the question is how to cultivate this virtue in the people more generally. And as though he does return to some of the ideas he raised in The Prince, such as that charismatic leadership is an important means of cultivating virtue in the people, and charismatic leaders should occasionally be quite cruel. He doesn't suggest that it's the be-all and end-all. In fact, he introduces a whole range of other ideas, like the need to eliminate great disparities of wealth, the need to use law as a form of education, the need to cultivate a vigorous religious belief, etc., etc. So the challenge of people who have read The Prince as a defense of amoral, princely rulership have often struggled to explain how The Prince tessellates with the Discorsi, which seems ostensibly to be more concerned with republics and other forms of governance. And it's challenging. It's challenging for those who see Machiavelli as this prophet of evil, because if you read it out of context, it can appear that he's advancing two completely contradictory viewpoints. Whereas the reality is, A, he's writing in response to slightly different circumstances for slightly different audiences, and also, in the context, the problems which he's addressing are essentially identical. In the 16th century, there is less of a sense of a radical difference between princely and republican forms of government, much less pronounced than we think today. So in actual fact, all he's trying to do is answer the question of how does a state of any kind, ruled in whatever way, maintain some kind of stability in this mad and changing world where fortune can, do whatever she likes.
It seems interesting to me that he is being held up by many people as a philosophical prophet in one way, and yet in his own deployment of these strategies appears to fail quite consistently. I mean, he does okay, but he doesn't seem to have the foresight that he's professing others should take on.
He doesn't have foresight, but what he does have is an extraordinary sense of self-honesty. He is not a sort of person who is unwilling to recognize where he's gone wrong, or so, arrogant that he cannot see fault in his closest allies and dearest friends. So in the Discorsi, for example, he takes issue with his former boss, the head of the Republic, with which he served so loyally for 13 years, 13 and a bit years, a man called Piero Soderini, is castigated quite severely in the Discorsi. For, admittedly, not for the worst thing in the world, but for being too kind and being too nice and being unwilling to act ruthlessly towards his opponents. But nonetheless, this is evidence of somebody who's willing to question his previous experiences. And indeed, he makes this very clear, both in the Prince and in the Discorsi. He says, I've been around a bit, I've seen things, and here's what I've learned.
Yeah.
And indeed, this is really the things this is something that you come across time and time again in his other works. At around the same time he's writing these books, he also writes a note to somebody who's about to go away on his first diplomatic mission, and Machiavelli says, these are the stuff I've learned. Take heed. He doesn't say he's always got it right. Indeed, he's aware that he's often learnt from his own errors. But there it is.
What are some of the main lessons that we should take away?
It's very difficult to answer that, because it kind of invites an answer which commits the kind of ahistorical sin that I have criticised already. But let's play the game anyway. I think two serious ones and one less serious one. A central theme running through all of Machiavelli's writings is fortune and the vicissitudes of fortune. Fortune, he says, is what rules the world around us, but he always imagines her as a woman. She is very unpredictable and very capricious. You never know when she's going to rise you up to the highest heights and when she's going to knock you down on your knees. She can't be won over, he says. She's not going to be placated with imprecation. She's not going to be placated with, virtue, anything like that. You are not going to be able to affect her decisions. So the only thing you can do is be ready to adapt, to be changeable, to be flexible, and when the moment comes, not to be timid, to act decisively when necessary. And that, I think, is one of the very... He first voices that in relation to Pope Julius II, who he admires for a time for his decisive action. But it is one of the very few points that you can abstract as a kind of universal principle, and I think is one which we can all apply to a certain extent in our lives, particularly at a moment of instability such as now. The second one, perhaps, is a little bit historical, but not too ahistorical. In many of Machiavelli's works, he displays an acute awareness of that the Florentine state, and indeed all polities, are weakened by great disparities of wealth. In Florence, since very early times, society had been divided between two groups: the popolo and the grassi, the people, and the fat cats, if you like. This is a rather simplistic way of looking at Florentine society, but it's not invalid. It's pretty okay as a model for looking at it. And he says this is problematic because each of these two groups has totally opposed objectives. The fat cats, the oligarchs, they want to dominate. And the popolo want not to be dominated. Now, obviously, we're not all living in 15th, 16th century Florence. And the circumstances enjoyed by experience by each of these groups is not duplicated today. But it is true that in today's political environment, we do see great disparities of wealth, creating a series of political problems. If governments which are obliged to look at almost any area, either of fiscal policy or social policy, are obliged to, particularly at a point such as now, when we are recovering from a terrible economic shock, of how to balance the interests of these two groups. And Machiavelli obviously says, if you can please both of them, that's hunky-dory. But he also says that on balance, it is better to stick with the have-nots for a variety of reasons that I won't go into at the moment. And that people might disagree with that, but nonetheless, I do think his analysis of his contention that disparities of wealth constitute a major problem for any polity wishing to establish stability remains true today, as it has always done. The less serious point is this. Machiavelli, as you said, was often getting things wrong. He was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. And he often got very depressed. He was quite frank about that in his voluminous correspondence. He often said how low he was and how miserable he was. But he always bounces back. He always keeps a smile on his face. He's always joking and laughing. And that, I think, is reassuring. I think it's reassuring because when we think of somebody like Machiavelli, it's a name that ranks alongside Aristotle, Plato, Marx, Hegel, etc. in importance. But knowing that he was a very human chap who got down, who had a laugh, etc., I think is somehow, I don't want to say inspirational, but it makes it seem as if these Olympian figures aren't so far beyond our reach.
I really like that. I spent my last birthday last year in Athens walking around the Agora and the Stoa Poikile, and then the year before that in the Roman Forum walking around the Colosseum and the Sistine Chapel. So for 2 birthdays in a row until COVID came in and spoiled it all, I was adding context to things that I'd learned and read.
Sure.
And I think I had undervalued how much that contributes to a greater, deeper understanding. It's only really when you can feel what it, and I hope to go to Florence. So I would have gone this year. That would have probably been my birthday this year had travel not been restricted. And I want to walk around the streets and I want to think and feel and, have an audiobook on Kindle with me or whatever. And, I understand what you mean. I think that by humanizing these figures, it makes their achievements feel closer. It makes them seem more mortal. It reminds us that they're not performative figures, although the performative nature of the prince is particularly funny, I suppose, in terms of a mirroring here. But they're not just performative figures. They're not these celebrities or like WWE wrestlers. They kind of feel a little bit like that. Larger than life. They become caricatures of themselves. And we see this with Machiavelli's work.
Absolutely.
And to hear that he's just a man who sometimes doesn't get it up for his missus, and he goes and gets in fights.
Not his missus, not his missus.
Okay, his mistress. Sorry, yes. No, you got to made sure that he performed for the missus. You got to do that. If you're going to cheat on her, at least perform when you get your hands on her. Yeah, I just thought, I think that's really right. But that's the thing that strikes me as why people are tending to misread his work, especially when they don't view it in the wider context, because they don't understand just how performative it was. That it was written as this thinly veiled, low-key job application with a very specific set of parameters for the person that he was trying to write it for. And presumably as well, if you're doing that for essentially one person or one group of people, you're not intending for it to be still read half a millennium later and published to the entire world to see. So it makes sense why people are misrepresenting that, or at least misunderstanding or misinterpreting it.
I would put a rider on that, actually. I agree with everything you say, absolutely. But I don't want to suggest that there is any one way of reading the Prince at all. The great benefit of placing Machiavelli in his context and humanizing him, and recognizing that his Prince and all his other works were written against a very specific set of circumstances, is important, not because I think that necessarily leads you to a true understanding of it, although I have my own opinion of it, and if I didn't think it was right, I wouldn't have written the biography. But I think by humanizing any political philosopher, it becomes easier to engage with their works at a meaningful, substantive level, critically, rather than viewing them as works of some Olympian genius far beyond our reach or our humble experiences, but as the scribblings of someone who was troubled or having difficulties or whatever. We can, effectively talk to them. I mean, like Cicero said of his books, you talk to your books, you criticize them, you challenge them, and maybe you produce something else out of it of your own. And that, I think, is much more valuable and a much more useful way of reading political philosophy, whether it be Machiavelli or somebody else's, than simply looking at it as reading it as a passive consumer.
What do you disagree with most? Talking about criticism and pushback, what do you disagree with most that was in Machiavelli's work, or assumptions that he held about the world or philosophy at large?
Oh, golly, I hadn't really thought about that. What do I disagree with? One of the reasons I haven't given a great deal of thought to that, I should confess, is because I actually find his lesser works much more exciting. I really like his poems and his plays, and they're very funny. And
you can't really disagree with a play, can you?
Not
you
really.
Can just say it's shit or good. That's really the spectrum.
Yes. I think there's some literary critics who might disagree with that. But yes, essentially. But there are little problems. I think. What would I disagree with? I think there are some. There are many aspects of his works which do not necessarily interpret his own times in an accurate way. So, for example, his tremendous faith in a citizen army, which is one of the most important points he makes in The Prince, the Discorsi, and in the Art of War, above all. He was very keen on this, partly because he had helped re-establish a citizen militia in Florence.
Can you just explain what a citizen army is?
A militia, sorry, of course. At the time, it was common for states like Florence to not have a standing army of their own. Instead, they employed mercenaries, often dozens of mercenaries, each with a couple of 20 or so horsemen, knights, soldiers, whatever, under their command, and cobbled together an army in this kind of imperfect way. And these were hugely unreliable. They were
Are these just pay-to-play guys?
Yeah, they were, exactly. You paid these guys to fight on your behalf. They worked for the highest bidder. They were necessary predominantly because wars were becoming bigger in scale and more professionalized, with more expensive equipment like cannons, crossbows, rudimentary firearms, etc., etc. So you needed professionals, and these guys had professionalism in spades. But because they were working for money, you couldn't always guarantee that they weren't going to betray you to
for a higher bidder,
or just not fight in the end or whatever. So Machiavelli argues vigorously throughout his life for a citizen militia. And what does that mean? That means your own citizens fight for you. Nowadays, this seems like a very obvious idea. And indeed, many modern states have made this the absolute cornerstone of their existence. The America, for example, the right to bear arms is absolutely fundamental to American existence, and the idea of fighting for your nation in defence of its liberty is axiomatic. But for Machiavelli, it was very new, and he gives the impression that any state that has a citizen army is going to be stronger than one with a bunch of mercenaries, except that at the time that just wasn't true. Florence develops under his oversight a citizen militia, and it may have contributed a bit to some successes like the recapture of Pisa. But when push comes to shove and it really has to show its mettle, it doesn't live up to expectations at all. When in 1512 Florence is attacked by an enormous Spanish papal army, and the militia is basically the only thing that's there standing between Florence and this crisis, and they're locked in a place called Prato, not far away, and they just don't do anything. They don't do anything. He repeatedly argues for it in other contexts. He tries to persuade the Pope to set up a militia in the Romagna, but it's not going to happen. It needs an apparatus that's completely different. Why is he wrong? Well, that's a different argument altogether. I think it was basically because it was too small and he wasn't well enough trained, and then he does talk about training. But that I think he got wrong, and that was in fact kind of recognised by many of the early readers of The Art of War. His view of military tactics, his view of mercenaries, etc., doesn't enjoy a great deal of popularity by readers of The Art of War, although it is hugely, hugely popular as a book. Instead, readers are more interested in his view of virtù or whatever. So what I disagree with that as a reading of how to fight a war in the 16th century. Nice idea, doesn't work in practice.
I like it. What are some of your favourite stories from him? You've got him turning up as an emissary covered in mud, sneaking in through the back door. Are there any other favourite stories you've got of his?
There's lots. Many of which aren't suitable for a family audience.
This isn't a family audience. Don't worry, Alex. This is a very mature audience, and it's got the explicit rating on iTunes, so you're good to go.
Excited to hear that. Well, it's an absolutely horrible story, actually, of when he's late in his career as Second Chancellor of Florence. He is sent to deliver a bunch of cash to the Emperor in northern Italy, and while he's on his way back, he experiences what he calls conjugal famine, which means he hasn't had sex for a while and he's feeling randy.
Conjugal
famine. It's a beautiful circumlocution, isn't it? It's really nice. Anyway, and he's walking back home one day, and opposite where he's staying, there's an old lady who does his shirts for him, who does his laundry for him. And she approaches him and says, "Hello, sir. Can I interest you in anything?" And she says, "I think I have something that might appeal to you in the cellar, or down in my place." And so he follows her, and she pulls back a curtain to reveal this prostitute sitting on a bed, and the light's very dim, and he doesn't really think she's very attractive, and her breath stinks a bit. It's not very appealing, but he's so randy that he thinks, what the hell? Anyway, so the inevitable happens, and then when he's done, he thinks, I think I better take a look at this lady. So he pulls the light closer, and the description he gives is just awful. The poor woman, you feel so sorry for her. He says, "Oh, it's just horrible." And anyway, I won't go into detail, but it so disgusts him that he is sick all over her.
Oh, that's bad.
And then he runs out. It's a horrible story. It's a horrible, horrible story. But that is kind of the guy he was. I think it's I've already mentioned how much I like his poems and plays, but these are the repositories of really lovely stories that may not necessarily have been indebted to his life, but were certainly or reflect his life, but they were certainly indebted to some of his experiences. So, for example, he writes a play called the Mandragola, where I won't give you too much detail because I know time's getting on, but basically a student who's just come back from Paris has heard about this really attractive lady, and he wants to see if she's as beautiful as everyone says, and it turns out she's even more gorgeous. The problem is she's married to an old fuddy-duddy of a lawyer who's a bit dim. Anyway, he decides that he's got to seduce her, and so he enlists the support of a good for nothing. And they consider all kinds of different plans of how he can get into bed with her. And they eventually hit upon an idea, which is to say that this couple have long wanted a child but have never been able to conceive. And so our hero dresses himself up as a doctor and offers them a solution, which is a potion made from a mandrake root. Make that what you like. And he says, drink this. As soon as you drink this, you will conceive. There'll be no problem. But there's a catch. The first person to sleep with you, lady wife, after you drink this, will die. So obviously it can't be your husband. So his accomplice suggests a way around this threat, which is to say that they will kidnap somebody who will draw out the poison and save the husband from the danger. And inevitably, it's the same guy, it's the student. And he allows her to be kidnapped, he sleeps with this woman, and she's, eventually he reveals himself, and she's so happy with it that they carry on their affair. And the husband thinks this is, thinks that he's been saved, and so is hugely grateful, and blah, blah, blah. So, another awful sexual story, I suppose. But it's that kind of bawdy humour is very, very emblematic of Machiavelli's way of looking at the world and his life. It's interesting that in that story we would expect him to project himself onto the student. But actually, it isn't the case. The husband whom he gulls is called Messer Nicchia. And there are lots of reasons why he's called Nicchia. But one of them could be that it sounds very similar to Niccolo. So in actual fact, he's putting himself in the position of somebody who is tricked. And again, that's evidence of his willingness to laugh at himself. So there you go. There are lots of other stories as well, which I won't go into. But if you haven't read them, they're a little bit difficult to find, but they're really worth reading. They're all hilarious, the plays and the poems.
It seems like he's got his unique weapon is his metacognizance. It's his ability to think about thinking and to see where he stands within the movement of things. He's obviously able to watch human nature and perceive it, even if he's not able to deploy the skills required to manipulate it himself. He's obviously very perceptive, and even perceptive of himself and his own failings.
Sure.
Which, when you hear these sort of stories about someone that, is a titan of the Renaissance, it really does humanize them in quite a sort of endearing way.
Yeah, exactly. You're right in saying that his self-awareness and his awareness of his place in his times is extraordinary. His greatest strength, yet in a funny way also perhaps reflective of his greatest weakness at the same time. And, very, very endearing. I'm not saying that everyone should aspire to be like Machiavelli in his private life. Let's be clear about that, because he was an absolute rotter. He was a fiend, not a fiend in the way that we think of, but he was as Alan Clark's wife said, he was an SH1T. He was. I'm not saying he's a model, but he's certainly more endearing, more human, more fallible. I think one of the reasons that I enjoyed writing this biography more than almost any other book I've written is because I found it much easier to relate to somebody fallible than to somebody who had taken great care to craft their image, blah, blah, blah. We've all had setbacks. We've all taken a blow or two from fortune. Maybe not of the same kind, but it's much easier to empathise with someone of that nature, and that's why I enjoyed writing, and why I hope people enjoy reading the biography.
I think that they will do. Alex, I really enjoyed this. Machiavelli, His Life and Times, in brand new paperback edition, will be linked in the show notes below. Is there anything else that you want to plug? Any other places people should go to check out your stuff?
There's another book I wrote a little while ago called The Ugly Renaissance, Sex, Disease and Excess in an Age of Beauty, which explores some of the hidden backstories behind the great art of the Renaissance, the seedy underside of the Renaissance belly, if I can put it that way. So if you like the naughtier bits of Machiavelli's life, that's another place that you might like to turn.
Perfect. I love it. Alex, thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few months. And don't forget to subscribe. It makes me very happy indeed. Peace.